Hi, today we're going to be talking about retirement. How do we retire? Why do we retire? What are all the factors that go into making this momentous decision in our lives? Then I'll tell you why I retired at 62. So come along for the ride. Welcome to the Further Journey channel. My name is Jeanette Slater, where we talk about all the wonderful and challenging changes that come along in second half of life. So today we're going to be talking about retirement. First of all, there are 3 ways I can think of. There's probably more, but at least 3 ways that I think of when I think of retirement. One is sort of the once and done. We're done, we're maybe working for the big corporation, and we say, that's it, I'm done, no more paychecks, I am now retired. That's one way to do it. Another way, depending on your profession, you can cut back on your time so that even though you're doing the same job, you don't have as many hours and therefore it's less stressful. Yet another thing I've seen people do is retire from their main job and then go get a different job that's much less stressful and perhaps takes less time. So why and when do we retire? There's a lot of different aspects to this that feed into that huge decision. For some people, they have a number in mind. I'm going to retire when I'm, say, 65. And that's the story they've been telling themselves, and other people have said, you retire when you're 65. And so they follow through on that, and that works for their lifestyle. Another reason some people retire is because they are fully vested in the company, so they're going to get a pension. And once you've crossed that line, then you have to decide, do I want to keep working or do I retire and take my pension? Another reason people retire is because their skills and abilities are becoming outdated. So I had a friend who was employed in the tech business. And while he was good at what he did, technology was changing. And so the company encouraged him to take early retirement with a very nice pay package. And that worked for him. I know that money also plays a big part of it. Some people feel like they can't retire at 65 because they still need the cash flow. So I had a friend I was working with when I was in real estate, and she was in her 70s, and she was still working real estate. I felt kind of bad for her. I mean, she was enjoying it, but she said, I can't quit because I can't afford to quit. And that also works into the timing of when we decide to retire. Health can play a big part of when we retire. For some people, it's their spouse or their parents who need extra help. And so that person may decide to retire because the help is needed at home or elsewhere. So that's a reason people retire. Or it could be their own health. I had a friend whose health was just falling apart, and she needed to retire in order to stay healthy. And speaking of health insurance, that is a big deal. When I was in my 50s, I heard older people talking about health insurance and how critical that was and what were they going to do. And I thought, what's the big deal? And then when I turned 60, 61, and we were thinking, should we retire? Health insurance became a big factor in that decision. Also, if we have a spouse or another dependent, that can make a big difference. So if the spouse is working, or if you're working and you're holding the health insurance for your family, you may feel like you need to keep working in order to hold on to that health insurance. That is also very big. And then some people retire because their spouse is retiring. I had a coworker that one day announced that she was retiring, and that really surprised me. So I asked why, and she said her husband was retiring and he wanted to travel. And so they decided they would both retire at the same time. I worked in ministry for about 15 years. And one of the stories, one of the narratives that I heard over and over again is that you don't ever retire because the Bible doesn't say anything about retirement. Well, I agree that after we retire, we should find ways to be productive and useful, but that doesn't mean we have to be tied to a job. I had a friend who was in ministry. He was a pastor, and he just couldn't seem to retire. And he was in his late 70s, and finally he died while he was still a pastor. He just couldn't see that anybody else could take care of his church. And that was sad to me because he and his wife never really got to enjoy any retirement. Another thing is some people also have a real sense of call to what they're doing. Their skills and their passions really come together in the job they're doing, and they don't want to quit. I had a friend who was a school teacher, and she didn't want to retire because she loved working with the kids, and she loved getting up every day and having a job to go to. So every year we would say, well, are you going to retire this year? And she would go, I don't know. And then August would come around. She said, I think I'm going to go for it one more year. And it's what she enjoyed. And so that also figures in to when we retire. I've also found people like my husband who had a real vision and a passion for what he wanted to do when he retired. And he just couldn't wait to retire so that he could work on his own. And that really was an instigator for him to want to retire early. I was a little different. We'll talk about that. So all of these feed into the decision about when we're going to retire. 3 of the biggies are, do we still need a paycheck? Can we apply for Social Security? And can we apply for Medicare? Those are often the driving factors, but I think those other pieces also often come into play. But there's one more that is rarely talked about. Whenever I watch videos about retirement, they're almost always talking about the financial end of retiring. But the reality is there's a whole personal and social end of this that we need to talk about. We're not going to talk about that today. I'm going to do a whole nother video on that. So what about my story? Why did I decide to retire at 62? Honestly, a lot of the things I mentioned played into my decision. So when we were 61, my husband and I are the same age, we went to our financial advisor for our yearly review of our investments. And while we were sitting there, he said, I think you're in good shape. I think you should retire when you're 62 and start taking Social Security. I was flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. That just had never entered my mind. Meanwhile, my husband beside me has a big grin on his face, and he is enthralled with the idea. And me, I'm sitting there, sirens are going on, red flags are waving around, and I'm going, no, we can't do that. That is not in the cards. Because I had grown up in a family and in a society culture that said you work as long as you can. You don't take early Social Security. In fact, you don't even take it until you have the maximum amount, which for us was 70 years old. And so that narrative, that story was going around in my brain, and I had to work through that. But our advisor said, I have worked with so many couples that delay their retirement until their body breaks down. They retire and they don't have the health to enjoy their retirement. So he encouraged us to go ahead and make the move. Well, we had a few things to discuss. Besides working through that old narrative, I had another axiom that I had always lived by: live within your means. And that meant to me within our cash flow. And so I did a deep dive into our budget, what we were actually spending in a month, and then how would our finances meet that if my husband retired. I was still working part-time as a realtor, but the main income was coming from his job. So that was pretty scary to me, to think we would not be getting that great paycheck every month. Now, he did get a pension, so I had to figure that in. And as I began to look at all the numbers, I thought, okay, this is actually something we could do. And of course, health insurance was the other biggie. My husband had the full-time job that provided a very wonderful health insurance for us. And I thought, what are we going to do from age 62 to age 65 for health insurance? Now, at the time, we were pretty healthy. And so I started looking around, and I did find something that would stopgap for us until we were 65. Besides my husband's vision and passion to be free of the 9 to 5 and to be able to work on the projects he had in mind, that was really pushing this. He was also taking a look at me and recognizing the stress that real estate was putting on me, and he was concerned about that. And he thought if we retired and started taking Social Security, I wouldn't feel so much pressure. So all in all, we did decide to take Social Security at 62. My husband did some temp work the first year. I kept working at real estate for the next 2 or 3 years in a very, let's say, passive way. And we made it work. One of the things I wanted to do was more travel. So we bought a teardrop trailer from some friends, and we made several long trips. We were living in Arizona, so we were exploring the West, and that was really fun. I can't say as I had a clear idea of what I wanted to do in retirement. And I think the first couple of years after you retire, some people do have that clear vision like my husband, but others like myself just need some time to breathe and some time to feel what this new era, this new walk into second half of life is going to be like. I could articulate 7 things that I was passionate about, that in the morning, one of these 7 things were like, this is why I'm getting up today. And that was helpful. And so over the next few years, I was able to look at those 7 items of things I really loved and say, how can I step more fully into one of these, maybe this year or 2 of them this year. So I've never regretted retiring at 62. It worked out well for us. We're 70 now, and we are very thankful that our financial advisor advised us to take early retirement. Retirement is one of the big decisions in second half of life that we can see coming down the pike. And there are lots of reasons why and when we should retire. Everybody has their own story. Everybody has their own journey in this. But still, we can support each other in the process. I'd love to hear from you where you're at in the process. Have you already retired? Was that a difficult decision? Or is that still in the future for you and you're thinking about, is now the time or when would be the right time? I'd love to hear your journey in moving toward or after retirement. So come on, let's walk this journey together.